In 185 BC, a general named Pushyamitra Shunga murdered his emperor during a military review. The emperor was the last of his line. With his death, an empire that had once governed almost the entire Indian subcontinent simply ceased to exist. It had taken one family 3 generations to build. It took 50 years to disappear. The Maurya Empire was the first power in history to unify most of the Indian subcontinent under a single government. Not a loose alliance, not a collection of tribute-paying kingdoms. A single administrative system, a single currency, a single legal code from the Hindu Kush in the northwest to the Deccan in the south. Nothing like it had existed before. Nothing like it would exist again for nearly 2,000 years. Before the Mauryas, India was a patchwork of 16 competing kingdoms called the Mahajanapadas. The most powerful of these, the Nanda Empire, controlled the Gangetic Plain. The Nandas were wealthy, militarily dominant, and deeply unpopular. In 322 BC, a young man named Chandragupta Maurya, advised by a brilliant and ruthless political theorist named Chanakya, overthrew them. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, is one of the most important political thinkers in world history. He wrote the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft so comprehensive it covers everything from economics and military strategy to espionage and the proper treatment of conquered populations. He was to Chandragupta what Machiavelli was to Renaissance princes, except Chanakya wrote it first, and he was not writing theory. He was writing what he had already done. In 305 BC, Chandragupta fought Seleucus Nicator, the Greek general who had inherited Alexander the Great's eastern territories. Alexander had invaded India in 326 BC and turned back after his army refused to go further. Seleucus attempted to reclaim those territories. Chandragupta defeated him. The treaty gave Chandragupta the modern territories of Afghanistan, Balochistan, and Pakistan, and Seleucus received 500 war elephants. By most measures, Chandragupta won. The empire Chandragupta built was not simply a military conquest, it was an administrative achievement. Chanakya's Arthashastra described a centralized bureaucratic system with departments for agriculture, trade, taxation, mining, and weights and measures. Spies were everywhere, monitoring officials, reporting on corruption, keeping the emperor informed of conditions across an empire too large to personally inspect. In 298 BC, Chandragupta Maurya did something extraordinary for a victorious emperor. He abdicated. He converted to Jainism and became a monk under the teacher Bhadrabahu. He left his throne to his son Bindusara and, according to Jain tradition, traveled south to Karnataka, where he fasted to death over a period of weeks in a ritual called Salakana. He was perhaps 50 years old. Bindusara ruled from 298 to 272 BC and expanded the empire south into the Deccan. He was called Amitrahata, slayer of enemies, by the Greeks. He maintained diplomatic relations with the Seleucid court, and a famous exchange records him requesting Greek wine, dried figs, and a philosopher. The Seleucid ambassador replied that Greek philosophers could not be exported. The empire was now enormous. What it needed next was not a conqueror, but an administrator. What it got was Ashoka. Ashoka was one of Bindusara's many sons. The succession was not smooth. Ancient sources, and the Buddhist tradition especially, describe a war of succession in which Ashoka killed or eliminated 99 of his brothers to secure the throne. Modern historians debate the numbers, but the violence of the transition is consistent with what happens when there is no formal succession mechanism and many claimants. Ashoka was crowned around 268 BC. For the first 8 years of his reign, he appears to have been a conventional, aggressive emperor. He expanded the empire, managed its internal complexity, and ruled in the tradition of his grandfather. Then, in 261 BC, he fought the Kalinga War. Kalinga, modern Odisha on the eastern coast of India, was the last major independent territory adjacent to Maurya lands. Ashoka invaded. The war was successful in military terms. In human terms, it was catastrophic. Ashoka's own Rock Edict 13 records the scale. 100,000 people killed in battle and 150,000 deported. These are Ashoka's own numbers. He is the source. What makes the Kalinga account unique in ancient history is what Ashoka says next. He describes feeling profound remorse. The edict reads, "When an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous and weighs heavily on his mind. An ancient emperor expressing regret about the cost of his own military victory is almost without precedent in the historical record. Ashoka converted to Buddhism shortly after Kalinga. His interpretation of Buddhism emphasized Dhamma, a concept roughly translatable as righteous conduct or moral law. He stopped hunting. He reduced or eliminated meat at the royal table. He banned animal sacrifice in the capital. He sent missionaries abroad, to Ceylon, to the Hellenistic kingdoms, possibly to Southeast Asia. He began constructing an empire-wide welfare infrastructure. The physical evidence of Ashoka's reign is still visible across the Indian subcontinent. He erected 33 major pillars of polished sandstone between 10 and 15 meters high at important locations across the empire. He had edicts carved into rock faces at the edges of his territory. These inscriptions are found in modern India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. They are the first significant body of writing from the Indian subcontinent, and they are government policy statements, not religious texts. What the edicts describe is remarkable. Ashoka built hospitals for humans and animals. He ordered the planting of shade trees and medicinal herb gardens along roads. He established rest houses for travelers every 9 miles. He appointed officers called Dhamma Mahamatas whose job was to promote welfare and tolerance among all religious groups. In the edicts, he explicitly mentions care for the elderly, orphans, and prisoners. Ashoka also sent his own son and daughter, Mahinda and Sangamita, to Ceylon as Buddhist missionaries. Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, converted to Buddhism and has remained predominantly Buddhist ever since. The Buddhism practiced today in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos traces directly to Ashoka's missionary activity. His religious influence outlasted his empire by more than 2,000 years. But there is a problem hiding inside Ashoka's remarkable record. Every policy that made him admirable as a human being was systematically weakening the structure that allowed his empire to exist. The military was being deprioritized. The Brahmin establishment was being alienated. The administrative apparatus required constant personal attention from a capable emperor, and Ashoka would not live forever. Ashoka died in 232 BC after a reign of approximately 36 years. He died in Pataliputra, the Maurya capital, modern Patna in Bihar. The empire he left was the largest in Indian history up to that point, roughly 5 million square kilometers, governing an estimated 50 to 60 million people, approximately a third of the world's population at the time. The fragmentation was immediate. Ashoka's successors, his sons and grandsons, divided the empire between them, fighting for the center while the periphery slipped away. The northwest, the hardest to hold, was the first to go. The Bactrian Greeks pushed back into territory that Chandragupta had won from Seleucus. Within a decade of Ashoka's death, the empire had already lost its western frontier. The Deccan followed. The southern territories that Bindusara had conquered proved impossible to hold without sustained military pressure. Local powers reasserted themselves. The Satavahanas rose in the Deccan. The Chera, Chola, and Pandya kingdoms in the far south had never fully submitted to Maurya authority and now ceased even nominal tribute. The empire was shrinking from every edge simultaneously. There were 8 Maurya emperors after Ashoka in the 47 years before the dynasty ended. 8 emperors in 47 years means an average reign of less than 6 years each. None of them commanded the authority, the administrative talent, or the military capacity needed to reverse the fragmentation. Each succession was either contested, abbreviated by assassination, or both. The empire was consuming itself. The Brahmin backlash was real and organized. Ashoka's promotion of Buddhism, his restrictions on animal sacrifice, his appointment of Buddhist monks to administrative positions. All of this had alienated the Brahmin establishment that had formed the backbone of Indian governance for centuries. The man who would end the Maurya dynasty, Pushyamitra Shunga, was a Brahmin general. The coup was political, but it carried the energy of a religious counter-revolution. In 185 BC, Pushyamitra Shunga was commanding general of the Maurya army. The last emperor, Brihadratha, was reviewing his troops, a formal military ceremony. Pushyamitra killed him in front of the assembled army. No one moved to stop him. This is significant. It means there was no one left who would die to defend the Maurya dynasty. Whatever loyalty the army had once owed the imperial family had been completely exhausted. Pushyamitra founded the Shunga dynasty and ruled from Pataliputra. One of his first public acts was to sponsor horse sacrifices. the Ashvamedha, which Brahmin ritual required and which Ashoka had banned. He persecuted Buddhists, according to Buddhist sources, though the extent of this is disputed. He was declaring, in the language available to him, that the Buddhist interlude was over and the old order was returning. The Maurya collapse has been studied and debated by historians for 2 centuries, and the explanations cluster around a few consistent themes. The first is structural. The empire was simply too large for the administrative technology available in 200 BC. Without telegraph, without railways, without modern communications, governing 5 million square kilometers required that every provincial governor be simultaneously competent, loyal, and uncorrupted. The Arthashastra itself acknowledges this problem. Most of its spy apparatus exists to address it. The second explanation is dynastic. The Mauryas had no stable succession mechanism. Chandragupta's abdication, Ashoka's succession war, and the 8 weak emperors who followed all reflect the same underlying problem. When the emperor is the empire, when authority is personal rather than institutional, the empire's survival depends entirely on the emperor's competence. Ashoka was competent, his successors were not. The third explanation is specifically Ashokan. His Dhamma policy, whatever its humanitarian merits, had strategic costs. An empire of this size required a military culture to hold it. Ashoka's pacifism, his preference for moral persuasion over military force, his reduction of the army's role. These were not neutral choices. They were a bet that moral authority could substitute for military power. In the short term, within his own reign, the bet held. After his death, it failed. There is something genuinely paradoxical at the center of the Maurya story. The qualities that made Ashoka one of the greatest rulers in world history. His remorse over Kalinga, his welfare state, his religious tolerance, his support for Buddhism, are precisely the qualities that made his empire impossible to sustain. He was a remarkable human being who built a fragile empire. Whether the trade-off was worth it depends on how you measure what matters. The legacy of the Maurya Empire is not the empire itself. The Shunga dynasty replaced it immediately. The Gupta Empire unified significant portions of India again 4 centuries later, and the Mughals would attempt the same project 1,000 years after that. What survived was not the political structure. What survived was Ashoka, his edicts, his symbol, his idea. The lion capital of Ashoka, found at Sarnath, is the national emblem of India. The Ashoka Chakra is the centerpiece of the Indian flag. The rock edicts are still standing. They are carved in Brahmi script, one of the ancestor scripts of most South and Southeast Asian writing systems. When archaeologists in the 19th century first deciphered Brahmi, they discovered that the author of these ethical inscriptions was an emperor of the 3rd century BC. The decipherment was one of the great shocks of Indian historical scholarship, a humane and thoughtful government policy from 2,200 years ago, written in stone, legible again. Ashoka's missionaries changed the religious map of Asia permanently. Buddhism, carried by the monks he sent out in every direction, became the dominant religion of Sri Lanka, and then of mainland Southeast Asia, and then of Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan. The tradition he patronized became one of the world's major religions, with approximately 500 million practitioners today. The political empire lasted 137 years. The religious influence has lasted more than 2,200. The Arthashastra. Chanakya's political treatise was lost for more than 1,000 years and rediscovered in 1905 by a Sanskrit scholar named R. Shamasastri in a library in Mysore. Its rediscovery revealed that ancient India had a systematic political science tradition that was at least as sophisticated as anything produced in the Greek or Chinese classical worlds. It influenced Indian political thought in the 20th century and remains a subject of serious academic study. What the Maurya Empire demonstrates about political organization is not uniquely Indian. It is a pattern that appears across world history with remarkable regularity. A charismatic founder builds an empire by combining military genius with political innovation. The empire reaches its peak under a great reforming ruler in the 2nd or 3rd generation. And then, lacking the institutional structures to survive weak successors, it collapses in a fraction of the time it took to build. Alexander's empire. The Mongol Empire. The Maurya Empire. The pattern recurs. The 50 years between Ashoka's death and the Shunga coup were not a sudden collapse. They were a gradual unraveling. Each emperor lost more territory, commanded less loyalty, and governed a smaller and more contested domain than his predecessor. The end point. Pushyamitra killing Brihadratha during a troop review, with the army watching and doing nothing, was the visible symptom of a process that had been underway for nearly half a century. Modern India chose Ashoka's symbols deliberately and with historical self-awareness. The Constituent Assembly debated the national symbols extensively. They chose the lion capital. Not a symbol of conquest, not a symbol of religious dominance, but the emblem of an emperor who wrote edicts about kindness to animals, care for the sick, and tolerance for all religions. They were making an argument about what kind of India they intended to build. Chandragupta, Chanakya, Ashoka. The Maurya story is one of the great founding narratives of any civilization. A young man from obscure origins, a brilliant advisor who saw potential no one else recognized, a grandson who became one of the most ethically serious rulers in world history. The narrative arc is clean and powerful. The historical reality was more complicated and ended badly. But the narrative has survived the reality, which is perhaps all any founding myth can claim. The Indian subcontinent would not be genuinely unified again until the Mughal Empire at its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, nearly 2,000 years after Chandragupta. Even the Mughals never controlled the far south. The British Raj came closest to the Maurya achievement in geographic scope, and it lasted 90 years before ending. The Maurya managed 137. That it ended the way it did does not diminish what it was. It was the first. For the Indian subcontinent, that means something. Pushyamitra Shunga killed the last Maurya emperor in 185 BC. He was trying to end a dynasty. He did, but he could not undo Ashoka's edicts, which were already carved in stone across the subcontinent. He could not undo the Buddhism that was already spreading across Asia. He could not undo the idea that a ruler could be judged not by how many enemies he had killed, but by how many sick people he had helped. The empire vanished. The idea did not.